On the 2nd day of June, 1944, beneath the brutal Tuscan sun, a single man began crawling across an open wheat field toward 4 machine guns that were designed to kill him. He moved at 1 meter per minute. The guns fired 1,200 rounds per minute. The mathematics suggested obliteration. Instead, what followed would rewrite the tactical doctrine of infantry warfare and prove that patience, wielded with absolute precision, can defeat firepower that should make survival impossible. This is the story of how Technical Sergeant Yaiki Kobashigawa turned geometry into a weapon and silence into armor, and why, for 56 years, almost no one knew his name. The wheat was young that morning, not yet tall enough to hide a man, barely reaching mid-thigh if you stood upright, which no one in the 100th Battalion was foolish enough to do. The field stretched perhaps 200 meters from the tree line where Kobashigawa and his squad pressed themselves against the earth to the first terrace slope where the German machine gun nests sat like gargoyles overlooking a killing floor. 200 meters. In open ground, under ideal conditions, an infantry squad could cross that distance in perhaps 90 seconds at a tactical run. But these were not ideal conditions. These were the conditions that made veteran soldiers whisper prayers and check their morphine syrettes and wonder if the mail they'd written the night before would reach home before the telegram did. The Caesar Line was Germany's last organized defensive position before Rome, and they had built it with the methodical precision that characterized everything the Wehrmacht did well. The position near Villa Crocetta represented a textbook application of defensive geometry. For MG-42 machine gun nests, positioned with overlapping fields of fire that left no dead ground, no covered approaches, no blind angles where an attacker could mass troops or find concealment. Each nest held a weapon that was, by every technical measure, the most effective machine gun produced during the Second World War. The MG-42, called Hitler's buzzsaw by American troops who survived hearing it, fired at a cyclic rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, so fast that the individual shots merged into a single tearing sound, like fabric ripping at inhuman speed. The gun's barrel could be changed in seconds when it overheated, meaning sustained fire was not a tactical limitation but a tactical certainty. The ammunition belts fed smoothly, the weapon jammed rarely, and its effective range exceeded 600 meters. Against infantry in the open at 200 meters, the MG-42 was not a weapon. It was a verdict. Kobashigawa studied the field with eyes that had learned patience in a different landscape, under a different sun, hunting prey that would kill you if you made a mistake. He had grown up on the island of Hawaii, not in Honolulu where some Japanese Americans lived lives that resembled mainland normalcy, but in the rural plantation country where the cane fields stretched to the horizon and wild boar roamed the volcanic slopes and gulches. Hunting boar had taught him things that no military manual contained, lessons written in sweat and failure and the occasional success that kept you coming back to learn more. A boar's eyesight was poor, but its hearing was extraordinary, and its sense of smell could detect human presence from hundreds of meters if the wind carried your scent. You learned to move with the wind, never against it, letting the air currents mask your approach. You learned that movement itself was not the issue, but sudden movement, the kind that triggered predator recognition in prey animals that had evolved to detect the exact moment when stillness became strike. You learned to time your advances with external sound, the rustle of wind through grass, the call of birds, anything that provided acoustic cover for the small, inevitable noises your body made. You learned about shadows, how they moved as the sun tracked across the sky, how they could betray you even when you were perfectly still if you positioned yourself wrong relative to your quarry's line of sight. Most importantly, you learned restraint. You learned that the hardest part of hunting was not moving forward, but stopping, holding position when every instinct screamed at you to close the distance, to finish the stalk, to end the tension. The boars that killed hunters were the ones that taught patience through negative example, the ones you rushed, the ones you underestimated, the ones you thought you had beaten before you actually had. The military had tried to train men in fieldcraft, in stalking, in camouflage and concealment, but military training assumed you had instructors who knew what they were teaching and time to practice and make mistakes without dying from them. Kobashigawa had learned from consequences, from empty-handed returns to camp, from boars that vanished like smoke when he moved wrong, from the humiliation of being outwitted by an animal that weighed 200 pounds and had a brain the size of your fist. He had learned in an environment where failure meant hunger and embarrassment, not death, which paradoxically made him a better student because the lessons stuck without the trauma that made men rigid and cautious in the wrong ways. Now he applied those lessons to a problem that would have seemed absurd if it weren't so deadly serious. For machine gun nests, interlocking fire, open ground, daylight, the tactical manuals called this a defeat mechanism, terrain and weapons positioned such that conventional assault would fail with near certainty. The casualties from the previous day's attacks had proven the manual correct. The 100th Battalion, already under strength from the brutal fighting up the Italian peninsula, had lost more men trying to cross this field, trying to flank the position, trying to suppress the nests with mortar fire while riflemen advanced. Everything failed because the Germans had done the geometry correctly, and geometry does not care about courage. But Kobashigawa had noticed something during the failed attacks, something that the other survivors either missed or dismissed as tactically irrelevant. The MG-42 nests were firing from prepared positions, which meant they were firing from behind sandbag or stone reinforcements that provided the crew with protection and the weapon with stability. That stability came from a tripod mount, a simple mechanical device that held the gun at a fixed height and allowed the gunner to traverse horizontally while maintaining a steady platform for accurate fire. Tripods were essential for sustained fire, but they imposed a limitation that seemed trivial until you understood how to exploit it. The gun could not depress below a certain angle without the tripod's legs interfering with the barrel's movement or the gunner losing the ability to operate the weapon effectively while prone. That meant there was a zone, a narrow band of terrain directly in front of each nest, where the gun simply could not aim. This dead zone began perhaps 15 meters from the nest and extended backward toward the German position. It was useless for assault purposes because reaching it meant crossing 200 meters of killing ground first, and once you were that close, the other nests could still kill you, and besides, what good was being 15 meters from a machine gun nest if you had no way to destroy it? But Kobashigawa saw a different geometry. If he could enter that dead zone while still being far enough from the adjacent nests that their angle of fire was less optimal, he could approach the first nest with something resembling safety, or at least with odds that were not purely suicidal. The problem was getting there. 1 meter per minute. That was the speed he calculated he could sustain while maintaining the absolute stillness between movements that would be necessary to avoid detection. 1 meter per minute meant 200 minutes to cross the field. More than 3 hours of crawling through wheat stubble in June heat, under observation, with German gunners scanning the field through binoculars because they knew the Americans had to try something eventually, and their job was to see that something before it became a threat. 3 hours of not making mistakes. 3 hours of breathing so slowly that your chest barely moved. 3 hours of ignoring the insects that would crawl across your face and into your ears and down your collar, because swatting at an insect created movement that human eyes could detect at 200 meters if they were looking in the right place at the right time. 3 hours of feeling the sun bake your back through the olive drab wool of your uniform, feeling the sweat run down your spine and soak into your belt, feeling the thirst build from uncomfortable to painful to nearly unbearable, and not reaching for your canteen because that movement, that momentary relief, could end you. 3 hours of maintaining such perfect muscle control that your body appeared to be part of the terrain, another irregularity in the wheat field, another shadow cast by the morning sun, nothing that registered as human to an observer who was scanning for exactly that pattern. He began the crawl just after dawn, when the light was still low and the shadows were long and the Germans in the machine gun nests were perhaps less alert because the Americans usually attacked later in the day, after their own artillery preparation, with covering smoke and suppressive fire and all the noisy expensive machinery of American firepower that announced its intentions from kilometers away. Kobashigawa brought none of that. He brought patience and a Thompson submachine gun and 4 Mark II fragmentation grenades and the knowledge that if he was wrong about the dead zone, if his calculation of angles and distances was off by even a few meters, the first burst from an MG-42 would cut him in half before he heard the sound of it firing. The wheat stubble pressed against his chest and stomach as he crawled, each stalk a small point of pressure that would become painful over time, small insults to flesh that accumulated into genuine agony but could not be acknowledged because acknowledging pain meant shifting position to relieve it, and shifting position meant movement, and movement meant death. His elbows took his weight as he pulled himself forward, inch by inch, using the toes of his boots to push when the ground allowed it, feeling for solid earth where he could exert force without creating the rustling sound of fabric against dry vegetation. The Thompson was cradled across his forearms, its weight familiar and reassuring, its steel surface already warming in the sun. The grenades hung from his webbing, each one checked and rechecked the night before, the pins straight and secure, the safety spoons held in place by his faith in American manufacturing and the fervent hope that a piece of shrapnel or a bullet strike wouldn't detonate them while they were still attached to his body. The first 20 meters took 40 minutes. Kobashigawa froze when he heard voices from the nearest machine gun nest, German voices speaking in that clipped, efficient way that Wehrmacht soldiers used when they were discussing professional matters, probably changing shifts, probably giving the relief crew the status report on enemy activity, which at the moment was non-existent because the enemy was 70 meters into their killing field and invisible because he understood that speed was not the variable that mattered. What mattered was being invisible, and invisibility was not achieved through camouflage alone but through the absence of the small cues that trigger human pattern recognition. No sudden movements. No regular rhythm that suggested animate motion rather than wind-blown vegetation. No silhouette that broke the horizon line when viewed from a slight elevation. No shadow that moved independently of the sun's angle. No sound of breathing or equipment rattling or fabric tearing on thorns. Invisibility was not a state of being but a sustained performance of perfect discipline, and the performance had to be maintained even when parts of your brain were screaming that you were exposed, that you should run, that staying still made you a target when actually moving made you a target and staying still made you terrain. The sun climbed higher and the heat became serious, the kind of heat that made veteran soldiers in Italy joke grimly about preferring the hedgerows of Normandy or the cold of the Ardennes. Anywhere but the Mediterranean summer where the sun felt personal in its intensity, like it was angry at you specifically for being there. Sweat soaked through his uniform and began to drip from his nose and chin, and he could not wipe it away because his hands were occupied with moving his body forward with the minimum possible disturbance to the surrounding wheat. The salt from the sweat got into his eyes and burned, and his eyes watered in response, and the tears mixed with the sweat and ran down his face, and he let them run because raising a hand to his face would create a vertical movement that might be detected by the German observer who was, at this very moment, scanning the wheat field through binoculars because scanning was what you did when you were on guard duty and the enemy was out there somewhere and your job was to see them before they saw you. At 90 meters, roughly halfway to the first nest, Kobashigawa heard the sound he had been timing his movements around, the sound that made this entire insane plan possible. The Germans were testing their machine guns, firing short bursts down the length of the field to keep the barrels warm and ensure the weapons remained functional. This was standard defensive procedure, the military equivalent of a musician keeping their instrument tuned. Every 15 minutes, give or take, one of the guns would fire a 5-second burst, the rounds tearing through the wheat at chest height for a man who was standing, at head height for a man who was crouching, at the altitude of angels for a man who was pressed flat against the earth and moving only when the sound of the weapon's fire masked any sound he made. The MG-42's report was so loud, its cyclic rate so high, that for those 5 seconds, the entire acoustic environment was dominated by that sound. A man could move then, if he was already in motion, if he was prepared to continue his crawl the instant the weapon started firing. A man could cover 3, maybe 4 meters during a 5-second burst if he was willing to risk the exposure, if his calculation told him that the other nests were focused on their own sectors and not watching the ground that their sister weapon was actively suppressing. Kobashigawa moved during those bursts. Between the bursts, he became stone, his breathing so shallow that his chest barely rose, his body absolutely still, his eyes half closed to eliminate the reflective surface of the cornea that might catch light and register as a glint to an observer with binoculars. Insects crawled across his face and neck, flies drawn by his sweat, ants exploring this new terrain feature that had appeared in their domain. He let them crawl. A German scout fly, the large buzzing kind that seemed to exist solely to torment soldiers in warm weather, landed on his neck and bit him, drawing blood, and he felt the sharp pain and the hot itch that followed and did nothing, because doing something meant moving his hand to his neck, and that movement would travel through his body and disturb the wheat around him and create a pattern of movement that might be visible to someone who was looking for exactly that kind of disturbance. Time became something other than the regular progression of seconds and minutes. It became a series of intervals between test fires, between the moments when he could move and the longer moments when he had to remain perfectly still and wait. His mind, deprived of physical activity, began to wander in ways that he had to control because mental distraction led to physical mistakes. He thought about home, about Hawaii, about the last time he had hunted boar in the gulches above Hilo, about the way the volcanic soil smelled after rain, about his family's plantation house and whether they were still there or whether they had been relocated like so many Japanese-American families on the mainland, rounded up and sent to camps because their ancestry made them suspect despite their citizenship, despite their loyalty, despite the fact that at this moment he was crawling toward a machine gun nest to kill Germans who would kill him without hesitation or remorse. The irony was not lost on him. The 100th Battalion, the Nisei soldiers of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, were fighting and dying in Italy for a country that did not trust them, that had imprisoned their parents and siblings behind barbed wire, that saw their faces and assumed disloyalty until proven otherwise through blood sacrifice. The 100th had earned the unofficial designation Purple Heart Battalion through the sheer volume of casualties they had sustained, fighting with a ferocity that seemed designed to prove their Americanness through body count, both enemy and their own. They had fought at Cassino at Anzio up the Italian boot through terrain that favored the defender and devastated the attacker, and they had done it without complaint, without the recognition that other units received, without the assumption of competence and courage that white soldiers were granted by default. Kobashigawa pushed those thoughts away because anger created tension, and tension created trembling, and trembling created movement, and movement created death. He needed to be empty of everything except the immediate task, the next meter of ground, the next period of stillness, the next test fire burst that would allow him to move again. Empty, still, patient. These were the qualities that would keep him alive. Not anger at injustice, not fear of failure, not hope for success. At 130 meters, just over 2 hours into the crawl, something changed in the German positions. He heard voices raised, not in alarm but in the tone men use when they are discussing something unexpected but not immediately threatening. A vehicle, perhaps, arriving with supplies or relief troops. A visit from an officer. Something that distracted the gunners from their watching, that pulled their attention away from the wheat field and toward whatever was happening behind their positions. Kobashigawa did not speed up. The temptation was enormous, the opportunity seemingly perfect, but opportunity was a trap if it made you careless, and carelessness meant dying stupidly after 2 hours of perfect discipline. He maintained his rhythm, moved during the test fires, froze between them, trusted his original calculation even when circumstances suggested he might be able to move faster. At 150 meters, he entered the theoretical dead zone of the nearest machine gun nest, the band of terrain where the weapon's depression limit meant the barrel could not be lowered enough to fire at a prone target. He was not safe, the other 3 nests could still kill him easily, but the geometry had shifted slightly in his favor. The nearest threat could no longer engage him with direct fire. If they wanted to kill him now, they would have to leave their prepared position, expose themselves, come out from behind their sandbags and fight him in the open. That thought provided a small cold comfort, the knowledge that he had solved one part of the problem, that his calculation had been correct, that the dead zone existed exactly where he thought it would. The final 50 meters took another hour. The wheat was thinner here, trampled by the German defenders moving back and forth from their positions, which meant less concealment but also less resistance to movement, less sound when he pushed forward. The machine gun nest resolved from an abstract threat into a physical structure, sandbags stacked in a shallow U-shape, the barrel of the MG-42 protruding from a firing slit, the matte Feldgrau helmets of the crew occasionally visible when they shifted position. He could hear them clearly now, talking in normal conversational tones because they felt safe behind their weapon, protected by 200 meters of open ground and the certain knowledge that nothing could cross that ground without being detected and destroyed. At 15 meters, Kobashigawa stopped crawling and began the slow, agonizing process of preparing for assault. He had to transition from horizontal to vertical, from invisible to aggressive, without giving the German crew time to react. The grenades came off his webbing one at a time, pulled free with movements so slow that they seemed to happen in photographic stills rather than fluid motion. He placed them within easy reach, verified the pins were accessible, rehearsed in his mind the exact sequence of actions he would need to perform in the 5 seconds he would have after the first grenade detonated and before the surviving Germans could respond. The Thompson came up into a firing position, stock against his shoulder, magazine checked, safety off, his finger outside the trigger guard until the moment came because training and discipline meant you did not fire accidentally, you fired intentionally with purpose when the tactical situation called for it and not a microsecond before. He waited for the next test fire burst from one of the other nests, used that sound to mask the small noises he made as he rose to a crouch. his legs screaming from the sudden demand to support his weight after more than 3 hours pressed against the earth. The test fire ended. He was crouching, exposed, 10 meters from the nearest enemy position, visible to anyone who happened to look in his direction. No one looked. He pulled the pin on the first grenade, let the spoon fly free, counted 1001, 1002, let the fuse cook off so the Germans would not have time to throw it back, and threw it with a smooth underhanded motion directly into the firing slit of the machine gun position. The grenade disappeared into the nest with a soft thud that meant it had landed on sandbags or equipment. Someone inside shouted a warning, the single word lost in the explosion that followed. A sharp crack that sent smoke and dust billowing from the position, followed immediately by secondary sounds, smaller detonations that might have been ammunition cooking off or might have been the screams of men dying inside a confined space filled with shrapnel and overpressure. Kobashigawa was already moving, his Thompson coming up as he charged the position, the 3 strides from cover to the sandbag wall taking less than 2 seconds. He appeared at the lip of the fighting position with the Thompson pointed down, finger on the trigger, and saw the aftermath of the grenade's work, the MG-42 tilted at an angle, 1 German soldier clearly dead, another crawling toward a pistol, a third stunned and bleeding. The Thompson fired, 3-round burst, simple point shooting at contact distance where you did not need sights, just nerve and the willingness to kill men who would kill you if given the opportunity. The crawling soldier stopped crawling. The stunned soldier fell sideways. The position was silent except for the ringing in Kobashigawa's ears and the distant shouts from the other machine gun nests. Shouts that meant they had heard the grenade, seen the smoke, understood that their perimeter was breached. The tactical situation had changed completely. He was no longer invisible. Every German position within 500 meters now knew that there was an American soldier in the first machine gun nest, which meant they would adjust their fire plans, call for mortars, possibly counterattack to retake the position before it could be exploited. The clock was running on a different scale now, measured in seconds rather than hours, speed rather than stealth. But he had broken the geometry. The first nest was destroyed, which meant the interlocking fire pattern was broken, which meant there was now a gap in the defensive line that other soldiers could exploit if they moved quickly enough, if they understood what he had done and adjusted their assault plan to take advantage of it. He pulled 2 smoke grenades from the dead German cruise equipment, popped them, and threw them into the wheat field behind him, creating a visual barrier that would confuse the other nests, make it harder for them to acquire targets, buy time for his own squad to move forward. Then he turned toward the second nest, which was approximately 70 meters to his left, positioned on a slight rise where a vineyard's terraces provided natural cover and improved fields of fire. He could not crawl to this one. They were alert now, watching, waiting for him to appear. Stealth had served its purpose, achieved the impossible, broken the line. Now the situation called for speed and violence and the willingness to close with an enemy who was prepared for him. The terrain between the first and second nests included a shallow drainage ditch, probably dug for irrigation, now dry in the summer heat but deep enough to provide defilade from direct fire if he could reach it. The distance from the first nest to the ditch was perhaps 30 meters of open ground. 30 meters in which the second and third machine gun nests would have clear lines of fire. 30 meters where the MG-42's 1,200 rounds per minute cyclic rate meant that staying exposed for even 2 seconds would be fatal. He did not hesitate because hesitation allowed fear to enter the decision-making process, and fear made you slow, made you tentative, made you the target rather than the threat. He exploded from the first nest at a dead sprint, low and fast, his feet pounding the earth in the distinctive rhythm of a man running for his life because that was exactly what he was doing. The air around him came alive with the tearing sound of MG-42 fire, rounds snapping past with the supersonic crack that meant they were close, that the German gunners had him in their sights and were walking their fire toward him, adjusting for his speed and direction. He dove into the ditch as the ground where he had been standing erupted in dust and flying wheat stalks, the rounds impacting so close that he felt the concussion in his bones. The ditch was perhaps a meter deep, barely enough to protect him from direct fire, certainly not enough to protect him from plunging fire if the Germans adjusted their aim or if they called for mortars which would drop shells from above and turn the ditch into a grave. Behind him, he heard the sound that told him his squad had understood what he was doing. Small arms fire, the lighter crack of M1 Garand rifles and the chattering of Browning automatic rifles, his own men suppressing the German positions, forcing the gunners to duck, making them choose between returning fire and staying alive. The fire was not accurate at this range, but accuracy was not the point. The point was disruption, making the Germans think about something other than the man in the ditch who was crawling toward their position at a speed that would have been impossible 20 minutes ago but was now essential. The Vineyard terrace that sheltered the second machine gun nest was built from stacked stone. Local limestone that had been quarried from these hills for centuries and assembled by farmers who were probably now refugees or corpses. Their land transformed into a battlefield by armies that cared nothing for property rights or agricultural tradition. The stone wall was perhaps a meter high, enough to provide solid cover for the machine gun crew, enough to stop rifle bullets and shell fragments, not enough to stop a man with grenades who was willing to get close enough to use them. Kobashigawa reached the base of the terrace wall and pressed himself against it, breathing hard from the sprint, his heart rate elevated but his hands steady because training and experience meant your body could be stressed while your mind remained focused on the task. The machine gun above him continued to fire, engaging his squad, the barrel protruding perhaps 3 meters from his position. He could not see the crew, but he could hear them, the metallic sounds of a weapon being operated under combat stress, the sharp commands of an NCO or officer directing fire. He pulled his remaining 2 grenades, both Mark II fragmentation type, 5-second fuse, effective casualty radius of 15 meters, easily capable of killing everyone in the machine gun nest if he could get them close enough. The first grenade went up and over the wall with a high arcing throw designed to clear the stone and land behind it where the crew was positioned. He did not wait to see the effect. The second grenade followed immediately, the 2-grenade technique designed to catch anyone who survived the first blast as they were trying to evacuate the position or return fire. The double explosion turned the Vineyard terrace into a storm of stone fragments and smoke, the blast amplified by the walls that contained it and reflected the overpressure back onto the machine gun crew. The MG-42 stopped firing. Kobashigawa came over the wall with the Thompson ready, expecting resistance, finding none. The second nest was destroyed, its crew dead or incapacitated, its weapon damaged beyond immediate repair. Another gap torn in the German defensive line. But the third nest, positioned on higher ground with a clear view of the Vineyard, had tracked his movement and was now adjusting fire toward him. He heard the rounds impacting the stone wall, felt the chips of shattered rock striking his helmet and uniform. The geometry was wrong now. The stone that had protected him from the second nest was inadequate against fire coming from a different angle, from higher elevation. He needed to move again, needed to reach the third nest before they bracketed his position and killed him through sheer volume of fire. His squad, emboldened by the destruction of the first 2 nests and understanding that the breakthrough was possible if they supported it, began to move forward through the wheat field, using the gaps in the German fire pattern that Kobashigawa had created. They advanced in short rushes, fire and movement, one element covering while another bounded forward, the fundamental infantry tactics that worked when the enemy's fire plan was disrupted but were suicidal when it was intact. Mortars began falling in the wheat field, German indirect fire called in by observers who could see the American advance and were trying to stop it with high explosives. The mortars were not particularly accurate, the rounds landing scattered across the field, but accuracy was not necessary when you were firing into a field full of infantry. The blast radius and fragmentation pattern meant each shell was deadly within a radius of dozens of meters, and the fear they generated was as effective as the actual casualties they caused. The third machine gun nest was positioned at the corner of a stone farmhouse, or what remained of a farmhouse after weeks of artillery exchanges had reduced it to a shell. The building's walls provided excellent cover for the crew and a perfect firing position overlooking the approaches. Kobashigawa could not assault this position alone. The distance was too great and the covering fire too effective. He needed help, needed his squad to maneuver into position where they could provide suppression while he made the final approach. He used hand signals, the visual communication system that infantry develops when radio is unreliable and shouting is suicidal, indicating the target and his intended approach and where he needed them to concentrate their fire. The squad leader, a veteran sergeant who had survived Casino and Anzio and knew exactly what Kobashigawa was attempting, nodded understanding and began positioning his men. The bar gunner found a shallow depression that gave him a stable firing position. The M1 riflemen spread out to avoid being killed by a single burst, everyone getting ready to execute a coordinated assault on the third nest. The signal came, a sharp whistle, and the squad opened fire simultaneously, a concentrated volume of small arms fire directed at the machine gun position, not aimed fire but suppression fire, meant to force the German crew to take cover, to stop firing their own weapon for the crucial few seconds that Kobashigawa needed to close the distance. He sprinted from the Vineyard terrace toward the farmhouse, covering ground that a few hours earlier had been impassable, running through mortar impacts and small arms fire with the kind of focused aggression that made him a difficult target because he was not trying to survive the next minute, he was trying to reach the enemy position and destroy it, and that singular focus made him fast and unpredictable. The third nest was more alert than the first two. The crew had seen what happened to their comrades, understood the threat, and were prepared for an assault. As Kobashigawa reached the farmhouse wall, a German soldier appeared in a ground-floor window with a rifle, aimed, fired. The round missed, not by much, close enough that Kobashigawa heard the supersonic crack next to his ear. He fired the Thompson from the hip, 3-round burst, the soldier disappeared back into the darkened interior. The machine gun crew was positioned behind a buttress on the far side of the farmhouse, protected from his squad's fire by the building's walls. He had to go around or through to reach them, and going around meant exposing himself to their fire, and going through meant clearing a building that might contain additional German soldiers. He chose through because speed was more important than safety at this point, and the longer he allowed the third nest to survive, the more casualties his squad would take from its fire. The farmhouse interior was dark after the brilliant sunshine outside. His eyes needed time to adjust, time he did not have. He moved through the doorway fast, clearing corners by feel and instinct rather than visual acquisition, the Thompson tracking ahead of him. The building was empty of living enemies, but contained the detritus of war, ammunition crates and ration tins and discarded equipment and the smell that told him there were bodies somewhere in the collapsed upper floor, casualties from earlier fighting left where they fell. The back door opened onto a small courtyard where the machine gun crew was positioned, 3 men, the gun mounted on a stone wall with a perfect view of the wheat field and the American advance. They were focused forward, engaging targets, did not see him emerge from the farmhouse until he was already firing, the Thompson's .45 caliber rounds impacting at close range, the kind of close range where marksmanship was less important than the willingness to commit violence without hesitation. The third nest went silent. Kobashigawa's squad poured through the gaps he had created, exploiting the breakthrough, widening the breach in the German line. The fourth machine gun nest, the final position in the defensive complex, began falling back without being directly assaulted, the crew understanding that their position was flanked, their supporting fires eliminated, their situation untenable. German infantry appeared from positions in depth, attempting to counterattack, to restore the defensive line before the Americans could consolidate their gains. The firefight became general, both sides maneuvering for advantage, but the decisive moment had already passed. The Caesar line was broken at this point, the geometry that had made it impregnable was destroyed, and the cost of maintaining the position now exceeded its defensive value. Kobashigawa and his squad consolidated on the high ground where the third nest had been positioned, established a hasty defensive perimeter, directed the rest of the company through the gap they had created. The wheat field that had been a killing ground an hour earlier was now filled with American troops advancing toward Rome, exploiting the breakthrough, turning a tactical success into operational opportunity. Medics moved through the field treating casualties, the wounded from both sides receiving care because that was what civilized armies did even in the middle of killing each other. The 100th Battalion continued the advance, fighting through subsequent German defensive positions that were less organized, less prepared, more willing to retreat rather than die in place. The road to Rome, blocked for weeks by the Caesar line, was now open. The liberation of the Italian capital, the first Axis capital to fall to Allied forces, was now a matter of days rather than weeks. The strategic implications were enormous, the symbolic value perhaps even greater. But the cost had been high, as it always was in Italy, as it had been at Cassino and Anzio and in the mountains where the 100th had earned its reputation through blood. The battalion had started the Italian campaign with over 1,000 men. By the time they reached Rome, fewer than half remained, the rest casualties, killed or wounded or missing, replaced by fresh soldiers who would themselves become casualties in subsequent battles. The Nice soldiers of the 442nd fought with a casualty rate that exceeded most other units in Europe, fought with a determination that seemed designed to prove something that should not have needed proving, that their loyalty was beyond question despite their ancestry. Rome fell on June 4, 1944, 2 days after Kobashigawa's assault on the machine gun positions near Villa Crocetta. The 100th Battalion marched through the city's streets, past cheering Italian civilians who threw flowers and offered wine, celebrating liberation from German occupation, celebrating the arrival of American soldiers who they assumed were all equal in the eyes of their own nation. The irony was perhaps visible to the Nice soldiers who understood that their families were still imprisoned in American concentration camps while they fought to liberate Europe, that their service was considered necessary while their presence in American society was considered threatening. Kobashigawa was recommended for the Medal of Honor by his commanding officer, who understood that what had happened in the wheat field was not normal combat action but something that deserved the highest recognition. The recommendation was downgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest decoration for valor, by reviewing officers who perhaps did not understand the tactical situation or perhaps understood it perfectly but did not believe that a Japanese-American soldier could perform at the level required for the nation's highest military honor. The pattern was consistent throughout the war, Nice soldiers receiving lower decorations than their actions warranted, their heroism acknowledged but not fully honored, their service accepted but not equally celebrated. The Distinguished Service Cross was still a significant decoration, still recognition of extraordinary valor, but it was not what Kobashigawa deserved, and more importantly, it was not what the historical record deserved. The Medal of Honor is not just a decoration. It is documentation. It is the nation's official statement that this action, this soldier, this moment represents the highest ideals of military service. By downgrading the award, the reviewing officers were not just denying Kobashigawa his full recognition, they were falsifying the historical record, suggesting that what happened in that wheat field was impressive but not exceptional, worthy of note but not of the highest honor. For 56 years, that falsified record stood unchallenged. Kobashigawa returned to Hawaii after the war, married, worked quietly as a manager for a hardware store, raised a family, rarely spoke about his combat service beyond the bare facts when asked. He was not bitter, or if he was, he did not show it publicly. He had done what needed to be done, survived when survival seemed impossible, broken a defensive line that was supposed to be unbreakable, and that accomplishment existed independent of whether it was properly recognized. The truth of what happened did not depend on medals or official recognition. The truth was written in the tactical result, in the lives saved by his action, in the road to Rome that opened because he understood geometry and patience and restraint better than the men who built the Caesar line. But in the late 1990s, the United States military began a comprehensive review of wartime decorations, specifically examining cases where racial discrimination might have prevented soldiers from receiving appropriate recognition. The review was prompted by growing awareness that the Medal of Honor had been awarded disproportionately to white soldiers, that minorities had been systematically undervalued in the awards process, that the historical record was incomplete not through accident but through prejudice. The review board examined thousands of cases, applied contemporary standards for valor awards, and attempted to correct historical injustices without diminishing the significance of the medal itself. Kobashigawa's action at Villa Crocetta was among the cases reviewed. The board examined the original recommendation, the tactical situation, the outcome of the action, and the decorations awarded to soldiers in similar circumstances. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The action met every criterion for the Medal of Honor. The original downgrade was not justified by the tactical circumstances but by the racial prejudice of the reviewing officers. The recommendation was approved, 56 years late but finally correct. On June 21, 2000, President William Clinton presented the Medal of Honor to Technical Sergeant Yaiki Kobashigawa in a White House ceremony that attempted to correct a historical injustice through official recognition. Kobashigawa was 77 years old. His war had ended more than half a century earlier. Most of the men who had witnessed his action were dead. The wheat field near Villa Crocetta had long since returned to agricultural production. The Caesar line existed only in history books and the memories of aging veterans. The medal was not late exactly because valor does not have an expiration date, but it was delayed, and the delay itself was part of the story, evidence of the discrimination that made the 442nd fight harder than other units for recognition that should have been automatic. The citation reads as a compressed version of tactical reality, the military's attempt to capture in bureaucratic language what happened over 3 hours in an Italian wheat field. It mentions the machine gun nests, the open terrain, the crawl, the assault, the breakthrough. It does not mention the insects or the heat or the 3 hours of absolute discipline or the calculation of dead zones and depression limits. It does not mention that Kobashigawa was fighting for a country that had imprisoned his fellow Japanese Americans, that he was proving loyalty that should not have needed proving, that his valor was exceptional even in a battalion where exceptional valor was common. The citation is accurate but incomplete, as all such documents are, because the reality of combat cannot be fully captured in written language, and the complexity of serving a nation that doubts your loyalty cannot be expressed in an official award document. Kobashigawa accepted the medal with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his life, thanked the president, thanked his family, thanked the memory of the men who had not survived the war to receive their own recognition. He spoke briefly about the importance of service, of duty, of doing what needed to be done regardless of recognition. He did not speak about injustice or discrimination or the 56 years his action had gone unrecognized at the highest level. Perhaps he thought those topics were self-evident. Perhaps he thought that receiving the medal at all, even decades late, was victory enough. Perhaps he simply had nothing more to prove, had proven it all in a wheat field in 1944. The tactical innovation Kobashigawa demonstrated, the combination of fieldcraft, patience, and geometric understanding that made his assault possible, gradually entered infantry doctrine not as a named technique but as an approach to apparently impossible tactical problems. Modern infantry schools teach the importance of terrain analysis, the exploitation of dead zones in enemy fire plans, the use of stealth and patience before violence and speed. They do not always mention Kobashigawa by name, but they teach what he proved, that geometry can defeat firepower if you understand the geometry better than your enemy does, that patience is not passive but active discipline, that one soldier with perfect understanding of a tactical problem can achieve what an entire company with imperfect understanding cannot. The machine gun nests he destroyed were rebuilt by subsequent German defenders, destroyed again by subsequent Allied attacks, rebuilt and destroyed in the cycle that characterized the Italian campaign. The wheat field was harvested, replanted, harvested again, the farmer probably never knowing or caring that in June of '44, a Japanese-American soldier had crawled across his property at 1 meter per minute and changed the outcome of a battle. The farmhouse was eventually demolished or restored. The vineyard terraces either maintained or collapsed. The stone walls either preserved or repurposed. The physical terrain returned to civilian use, the evidence of combat erased by time and agriculture and the human need to return land to productive purpose after war has devastated it. But the tactical lesson remained, preserved not in the terrain but in the doctrine, in the stories told by veterans to younger soldiers, in the analysis of historians who studied the Italian campaign and tried to understand how the Allies eventually broke through defensive lines that seemed unbreakable. The lesson was simple in concept, enormously difficult in execution. Understand the geometry of the battlefield better than your enemy. Find the gaps in their fire plan that they believe do not exist. Move when movement seems impossible, but move correctly, with discipline and patience and absolute control. Be willing to spend hours to advance meters, if those meters break the enemy's geometric advantage. Most importantly, understand that courage without skill is just casualties, but skill without courage is just theory, and what wins battles is the combination of both applied at exactly the right moment in exactly the right place. Kobashigawa died in March of 2005, 5 years after receiving the Medal of Honor, 87 years old, surrounded by family in Hawaii where he had been born and to which he had returned after proving his loyalty in the most direct way possible. His funeral was attended by veterans, by military officials, by representatives of the Japanese-American community, who understood that his service and recognition represented something larger than one man's valor. He was buried with full military honors, his coffin draped with the flag he had fought for, the flag that represented a nation that had doubted him and that he had served anyway, that had imprisoned his fellow citizens and that he had defended anyway, that had denied him recognition and that eventually, belatedly, had acknowledged what he achieved. The lessons of Villa Crocetta extend beyond military tactics. They speak to the power of patience in a world that values speed, the power of observation in a world that values action, the power of understanding in a world that values force. Kobashigawa did not defeat 4 machine gun nests through superior firepower or numerical advantage or technological innovation. He defeated them through understanding their limitations better than they understood his capabilities, through discipline so perfect that it appeared superhuman but was actually the result of training that began in Hawaiian gulches hunting boar, through the willingness to endure discomfort and fear and pain for hours in order to create seconds of decisive action. The mathematics that suggested his obliteration were correct given the assumptions they were based on, but the assumptions were incomplete. They assumed he would move at normal infantry speed, would cross the field in minutes rather than hours, would make the small inevitable mistakes that soldiers make under stress. They assumed he was playing the same game they were playing, that the geometry they had calculated would apply to him the way it applied to everyone else. They were wrong, and their wrongness cost them the Caesar line and the road to Rome and ultimately the war itself, because tactics like Kobashigawa's, repeated across thousands of battlefields by soldiers who understood that the apparently impossible might just be the extremely difficult, slowly ground down the German defensive advantages until the geometry favored the Allies and the outcome became inevitable. If you've stayed with this story until now, you understand that history is not just the story of great armies and grand strategies and political decisions made in distant capitals. History is also the story of individual soldiers making individual decisions under impossible pressure, finding solutions to problems that should not have solutions, proving that human ingenuity and discipline and courage can overcome mechanical advantages that seem insurmountable. Kobashigawa's story deserves to be remembered not just as an inspiring tale of heroism, but as a tactical lesson in what becomes possible when skill and patience are valued as highly as speed and firepower. If this story has moved you, if you found value in learning about a soldier whose name should be as famous as any Medal of Honor recipient but remains largely unknown, I would ask you to share it, to ensure that his story reaches beyond those already interested in military history to anyone who appreciates excellence in any field, anyone who has ever faced an impossible problem and wondered whether there might be a solution that no one else had considered. Share it with anyone who needs to be reminded that patience is not weakness but a form of strength, that observation is not passivity but active engagement with reality, that the most direct path to an objective is not always the best path. I would ask you to consider the question that Kobashigawa's story raises. In your own life, in your own challenges, are there moments when patience and observation might achieve what force and speed cannot? Are there geometric problems masquerading as courage problems, situations where the solution is not to try harder but to understand better? The battlefield is an extreme environment that reveals truths about human performance and problem-solving that apply beyond combat. And Kobashigawa's story is ultimately not just about war, but about the universal human experience of facing apparently impossible odds and discovering that impossibility is sometimes just difficulty that has not yet been properly analyzed. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of forgotten heroes and tactical innovations and the small moments that change the course of history. Like this video if you think Kobashigawa's story deserves to be more widely known. Share your thoughts in the comments about what lessons from his experience might apply to challenges you've faced or problems you're currently solving. And remember that the next time you encounter a situation that seems impossible, someone before you has probably faced similar odds and found a way through, not by being stronger or faster or luckier than everyone else, but by understanding the geometry of the problem better than anyone thought possible.